The smell of polished mahogany and leather-bound law books pressed down on Frank Miller like a physical weight. Afternoon sunlight slanted through Venetian blinds, cutting sharp lines across Charles Winston's desk. The elderly lawyer's face remained impassive as he slid a thin manila folder across the immaculate surface. "I'm sorry, Frank. Your father left you nothing." The words hung in the air like smoke. Frank stared at Winston, waiting for some flicker of emotion, regret perhaps, or even embarrassment. But the lawyer's eyes remained cool and professional behind wire-rimmed glasses, his expression betraying nothing but mild detachment. "That can't be right." Frank's calloused fingers remained motionless on the armrests of his chair. "We worked that land together for 20 years. Every fence post, every repaired roof, that was me beside him. He always said, what George may have said informally and what he put in legal documents are different matters." Winston's voice carried the practiced patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. "The will is quite clear. Your father's estate is to be liquidated with proceeds going to various charitable organizations he supported." Frank tried to process the information through the fog of disbelief. 20 years of sweat and sacrifice on the family farm, of early mornings and late nights, of plans made over kitchen tables and promises spoken between father and son while mending equipment in the old barn, all of it rendered meaningless by whatever words were typed on the papers inside that folder. "Can I see it?" Frank reached for the folder, but Winston placed a manicured hand on top of it. "Of course. But I should prepare you. The language is unambiguous." Frank flipped through the document, legal terms swimming before his eyes. He recognized his father's signature on the final page, the same strong, deliberate strokes he'd seen countless times on checks, contracts, and birthday cards. "This doesn't make sense." Frank closed the folder, a hollow feeling expanding in his chest. "My daughter and we were counting on this. The bank is 3 weeks from foreclosing on our apartment. I just lost my job at Henderson's. Sarah and I might end up—" Winston's expression remained unchanged, but he cleared his throat, cutting off Frank's words. "Your personal circumstances, while unfortunate, have no bearing on your father's will. My duty is simply to execute his legal wishes." Frank stared out the window at the small town's main street. The farm had been in the Miller family for generations. Every childhood memory, every lesson learned, every moment of connection with his father had happened on that land. And now it would be sold to strangers. "When did he make these changes? The last time we spoke about it?" "The will was updated 6 months ago." Winston adjusted his glasses. "Shortly after his diagnosis. Everything was done properly, I assure you." 6 months ago, around the time George had grown more distant, more secretive, Frank had attributed it to the illness, to his father coming to terms with mortality. Now he wondered what else had changed in those final months. "Is there anything else I should know?" Frank asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Winston hesitated almost imperceptibly. "No, that covers everything." The lawyer rose from his chair, signaling the end of their meeting. "You have my condolences, Frank. Your father was a good man." Frank walked out of the office into the bright afternoon sunlight, folder clutched in his hand. The world continued around him, people chatting on sidewalks, cars rolling past, life proceeding normally while his had just been upended. He stood motionless beside his weathered pickup truck, the reality of his situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. No inheritance meant no safety net, no backup plan, no way to provide stability for Sarah after everything she'd already lost when her mother died 2 years ago. At 12 years old, his daughter had endured more grief and uncertainty than any child should, and now he couldn't even promise her they'd have a home next month. The drive back to their apartment complex took 15 minutes, but Frank's mind traveled much further. He replayed conversations with his father, searching for clues, for any hint that George had been planning to cut him out. Nothing made sense. His father had been stern at times, traditional in his expectations, but there had never been a major falling out, no unforgivable transgression that would explain this final rejection. Frank parked in front of the faded 2-story building they called home. The foreclosure notice that had arrived last week was still crumpled in his glove compartment. Without his job at Henderson's Automotive, and with no inheritance to fall back on, they had maybe 3 weeks before they'd need to find somewhere else to go. He sat in the truck, gripping the steering wheel, gathering himself before facing Sarah. He couldn't let her see him broken. Not when she'd already weathered so much. The apartment door opened to the smell of pasta sauce and the sound of Sarah's favorite music playing softly. She stood at the stove stirring a pot, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that made her look so much like her mother that Frank's heart caught in his chest. "Dad," her face brightened, then immediately grew serious as she studied his expression. "What did Mr. Winston say? Are we going to move to the farm?" For a moment, Frank considered lying, completely telling her everything was fine, that they'd figure something out. But Sarah was too perceptive, too familiar with the weight adults carried when they weren't being truthful. "It's complicated, sweetheart." Frank set his keys on the counter. "Grandpa's will wasn't what we expected. The farm will be sold." Sarah's spoon paused mid-stir. "But why?" "He loved that place. He loved us. It doesn't make any sense." "No, it doesn't." Frank managed a small smile. "But we'll be okay. I've got some leads on jobs, and we've got each other right." Sarah nodded, but her eyes held questions he couldn't answer. "Grandpa told me stories about that farm, about how the Millers have always been there taking care of it. He said it was special, that we had responsibilities." Frank looked at his daughter with surprise. "What kind of responsibilities?" "He never really explained." Sarah turned back to the stove. "Just that our family had to protect what belonged to us, that it was important, more important than most people could understand." The comment nagged at Frank throughout dinner. George had never spoken to him that way about the farm, at least not in those exact terms. It had always been about tradition, about keeping the family business going, about the value of the land itself. But the way Sarah described it sounded different, more secretive, more urgent. After Sarah went to bed, Frank sat at their small kitchen table with a beer, staring at his father's will. Something felt off about the whole situation. The timing, Winston's careful neutrality, the complete lack of explanation. He decided he needed to see the farm one more time before it was sold, to retrieve any personal belongings and perhaps to look for answers. The next morning was Saturday. Frank suggested they drive out to the farm to collect some of George's personal effects before the estate sale. Sarah leapt at the chance, throwing on her jacket before he'd even finished speaking. The eagerness in her eyes made him realize how important her connection to George and the farm really was. The hour-long drive took them from the edges of town into rolling farmland. Sarah pressed her face to the window, taking in the familiar landmarks that led to her grandfather's property. Frank felt a tightening in his chest as they turned onto the long gravel driveway. The white farmhouse stood sentinel against the horizon, just as it always had. The red barn, the equipment sheds, the old silo, all of it looked exactly the same. It was difficult to believe they no longer belonged here. As they approached the house, Frank noticed something odd. A black sedan parked near the barn, one he didn't recognize. He slowed the truck, a feeling of unease growing. "Dad, who's that?" Sarah asked, pointing toward the barn, where two men in dark jackets appeared to be examining the building's exterior. "I don't know." Frank stopped the truck a good distance away. "Stay here for a minute, okay?" He stepped out, approaching the strangers with measured caution. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The men turned, startled by his voice. The taller one, silver-haired, expensively dressed, recovered quickly, offering a practiced smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "Ah, you must be Frank Miller." "Victor Reed." He extended his hand. "Reed Enterprises. I've been in discussions with the estate attorney about purchasing this property." Frank shook the hand automatically, though everything in him resisted the gesture. "The estate is still being settled. My father only passed 2 weeks ago." "Of course, and my condolences." Reed's tone suggested he was merely observing a formality. "We're just conducting a preliminary assessment. Hope you don't mind." The second man, shorter, with close-cropped hair and a watchful expression, nodded curtly but offered no introduction. Something about his stance, the careful positioning, the constant scanning of surroundings, suggested military or security training. "Actually, I do mind." Frank maintained a civil tone despite the anger building inside him. "The property isn't available for viewing yet. I'd appreciate it if you'd come back after contacting Winston officially." Reed's smile tightened. "I understand, just eager to move things along. This location has significant potential." As the men walked to their car, Frank noticed the shorter man say something to Reed, gesturing subtly toward the barn. Reed's expression darkened momentarily before he composed himself. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Miller," Reed called as they climbed into the sedan. "I have a feeling we'll be seeing more of each other." Frank watched the car disappear down the driveway, uneasiness settling in his stomach. Why would a development company be interested in an old farm? And how had they gained access so quickly after George's death? Sarah joined him, slipping her hand into his. I don't like that man, she said simply. Me neither, sweetheart. Frank squeezed her hand. Let's go inside. The farmhouse smelled of dust and stillness. Frank moved through the rooms with reverence, taking in the familiar sights, his father's reading chair by the window, the collection of farming magazines on the coffee table, the row of family photos on the mantel. Sarah gravitated immediately to the kitchen, running her hands over the worn wooden table where she'd spent countless hours with her grandfather. He always sat here, she said, touching a specific chair, and he'd read from his Bible while I did homework. Frank nodded, suddenly remembering his father's Bible, the worn leather volume that had been his constant companion. Where is it, the Bible? In his office. Sarah led the way down the hall to the small room George had used for farm business. He kept it on his desk. The office was austere and practical, like the man himself. A heavy oak desk dominated the space, its surface organized with military precision, and there in the center lay the Bible, its leather cover cracked and softened by decades of handling. Frank approached it slowly, feeling like an intruder in his father's private space. The Bible had been more than just scripture to George. It was where he recorded important dates, pressed flowers from significant occasions, kept notes on sermons that had moved him. Frank opened it carefully, half expecting some message, some explanation for the will that had left him with nothing. The pages fell open naturally to Psalms, a section his father had often turned to. But something was different. A rectangular cutout had been made in several pages, creating a small hollow. And nestled in that hollow was a small brass key, its surface dulled with age. Dad, look! Sarah reached over and carefully lifted the key. It's like a treasure map clue. Frank took the key, examining it. It was old-fashioned, possibly handmade with no identifying marks or numbers. I wonder what it opens. Grandpa was hiding it for a reason. Sarah's eyes shone with excitement. He wanted someone to find it. Frank turned the key over in his palm, his earlier suspicions growing stronger. A hidden key reads unusual interest in the property, Winston's careful neutrality. Something was happening beyond a simple inheritance dispute. Let's look around, Frank suggested. See if we can figure out what this opens. They spent the next hour searching the house, trying the key in every lock they could find. None matched. Frank was about to suggest they take a break when Sarah pointed toward the barn through the kitchen window. We haven't tried out there yet. The barn had always been George's domain, the place where he maintained equipment, stored feed, and occasionally retreated when he needed solitude. As they crossed the yard, Frank noticed something he'd missed earlier, fresh tire tracks leading around to the back of the structure, where the men from Reed Enterprises had been examining the exterior. Inside the barn smelled of hay oil and decades of agricultural work. Afternoon light streamed through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating dancing dust particles. Sarah moved ahead, exploring with the fearlessness of youth, while Frank took in the familiar space, now seeing it through new eyes. What would Reed want with this old barn? What had his father been protecting? Dad? Sarah's urgent whisper came from the back of the barn. There's someone coming. Frank hurried to her side, peering through a crack in the weathered boards. The black sedan had returned, parking behind the barn where it couldn't be seen from the main road. Reed and his companion emerged, accompanied now by a third man whom Frank recognized with shock. Robert Stanton, a local businessman who had occasionally done deals with George. Stay quiet, Frank whispered to Sarah, pulling her behind a stack of hay bales. They crouched together as the men entered the barn through the rear door. Should have waited until we confirmed the sun was gone, Stanton was saying, his voice tense. If he finds anything before we do, he won't. Reed's confidence was absolute. The will took care of that. As far as he knows, his father left him nothing. He has no reason to look deeper. Frank's heart pounded as he strained to hear every word. Sarah pressed against him, her eyes wide but unafraid. Winston assured me the documents weren't in the house, Reed continued. George was too smart for that, but they have to be somewhere on this property. And if Miller's son finds them first, the third man's voice was low, professional. Then we make him an offer, Reed replied coolly. Everyone has a price, especially someone about to lose their home. Frank tensed. How did Reed know about their financial situation? And if he refuses, Stanton pressed. Reed's laugh held no humor. Then we remind him he has a daughter to think about. Security schooling, stability children need, so many things, don't they? The implicit threat sent ice through Frank's veins. He tightened his grip on Sarah's shoulder, silently promising to protect her from whatever this was. The soil samples confirm what we suspected, the third man said, changing subjects. The aquifer runs directly beneath this section of the valley. If we secure this property in the Henderson Tract, we control the entire water supply. Worth billions once the drought conditions worsen, Reed agreed. The projections show 3 years before the surrounding counties are desperate enough to pay whatever we ask. The men moved deeper into the barn, their voices becoming indistinct. Frank waited until he was certain they were out of earshot before turning to Sarah. "We need to get out of here," he whispered. "Back to the truck, very quietly." They crept toward the main doors, keeping low behind equipment and storage containers. Just as they reached the exit, Sarah tugged at Frank's sleeve, pointing toward the far wall where the men were now examining something. Behind a row of old barrels, partially hidden by shadows, was a section of wall that looked newer than the surrounding boards. The men were running their hands over it, looking for something. "The foundation access should be here somewhere," Stanton was saying. "George showed it to me years ago before." Frank filed the information away, then hurried Sarah out of the barn and across the yard to their truck. He started the engine as quietly as possible and drove away slowly, taking a back road off the property to avoid being seen. Sarah remained silent until they were on the main road miles from the farm. "They're bad men," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Frank agreed, his mind racing through the implications of what they'd overheard. "And they're looking for something Grandpa hid. Something important." "The key," Sarah said with certainty. "It's for whatever they're trying to find." Frank nodded, the weight of this new knowledge settling over him. His father hadn't betrayed him. He'd been protecting him and Sarah, and something valuable enough that men like Reed would threaten a child to obtain it. "We can't go home," Frank decided aloud. "Not yet. They might be watching our apartment." "Where will we go?" Sarah asked, her voice calm despite the circumstances. Frank thought for a moment. Eleanor Jenkins. Grandpa trusted her. Eleanor had been their nearest neighbor, a widow who had formed a close friendship with George over decades of shared fences and mutual assistance. The Jenkins farmhouse sat just 2 miles from the Miller property. Eleanor answered her door with surprise that quickly turned to concern when she saw their expressions. "Frank, Sarah, what's happened?" Eleanor Jenkins was a sturdily built woman of 68 with practical clothes and silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. Her weathered face showed the outdoor life she'd led alongside her late husband, but her eyes remained sharp and alert. "We need a place to stay tonight, Eleanor, and some advice." Frank glanced meaningfully at Sarah. "It's about Dad's farm." Eleanor ushered them inside without hesitation. Her home was warm and lived in, with handmade quilts and the scent of recent baking. "Sarah, there are fresh cookies in the kitchen. Why don't you help yourself while your father and I talk?" Once Sarah was out of earshot, Frank lowered his voice. "Did you know Reed Enterprises was interested in Dad's land?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "They've been circling like vultures for years. Your father turned them down repeatedly. They're at the farm now with Robert Stanton." Frank watched Eleanor's reaction carefully. They were looking for documents Dad hid somewhere. Eleanor sat heavily in her armchair, the news clearly disturbing her. "I was afraid of this. When Thomas, my husband, died 10 years ago, George became the last one who knew everything." Knew what, Eleanor? She studied him for a long moment, as if making a decision. "The truth about the valley, about the water." Frank leaned forward. "We overheard Reed talking about an aquifer." "It's more than just an aquifer." Eleanor's voice dropped further. "It's one of the largest untapped freshwater resources in the state, pure, naturally filtered. The families who settled this valley discovered it generations ago and kept it secret." Frank tried to make sense of this revelation. "They formed an association, the Valley Protection Society. Your great-grandfather was a founding member. They created legal protections trusts that would prevent any single owner from selling water rights. They understood that whoever controlled the water would eventually control everything." Frank thought of the drought conditions that had been worsening for years, of reports about water tables dropping across the region. "And Reed wants to control it." Eleanor nodded grimly. "They've been buying up properties piece by piece. Your father was one of the last holdouts." When he got sick, she hesitated. George knew they'd come after you next, try to pressure you when you were vulnerable. So he changed his will. Frank's earlier confusion began to clear. Made it look like I got nothing so they'd leave me alone. That sounds like George. Eleanor's smile was sad, always 3 steps ahead, but never explaining his moves to anyone else. Frank pulled out the brass key. We found this hidden in Dad's Bible. Eleanor's eyes widened. The first key. She said it with such certainty that Frank felt a jolt of recognition. There's more than one. According to Thomas, yes, George never shared the details with me, but I know he was the keeper of the society's records. Everything that proved their legal claim to the water rights. Reed would do anything to destroy those records. Frank turned the key over in his hand, this small object suddenly representing something much larger than he had imagined. We need to go back to the farm, tonight after Reed and his men leave. Eleanor nodded slowly. You'll need to be careful, and you'll need to decide how much to tell Sarah. She's already involved, Frank said. She was there when we overheard Reed. And Dad had already started telling her things. About responsibilities. About protecting what belongs to us. George always did have a soft spot for that girl. Eleanor smiled. He said she had the Miller stubbornness, but twice the brains. By nightfall, Reed's sedan was gone from the property. Frank parked on a neighboring access road, and they approached the farm on foot using the cover of darkness and Frank's intimate knowledge of the land to avoid being seen from the main road. The barn loomed against the night sky, a darker shadow among shadows. Frank carried a flashlight, but kept it off until they were safely inside. Sarah stayed close beside him, her earlier excitement now tempered by the seriousness of their mission. Where should we start? Sarah whispered. Frank directed the flashlight's beam toward the back wall where Reed and his men had been searching. There, behind those barrels. They made their way carefully through the barn, moving equipment and supplies until they reached the row of old barrels. Behind them, just as Frank had glimpsed earlier, was a section of newer wooden boards. It looks different, Sarah observed, running her hand along the surface. Smoother. Frank examined the wall carefully, looking for any sign of a lock or mechanism. The boards appeared solid with no visible seams or openings. He pressed against various sections, testing for loose panels. Maybe we need to move the barrels completely, Sarah suggested. Together, they rolled the heavy containers aside, clearing the entire section of wall. Frank ran the flashlight slowly across the exposed surface, looking for anything unusual. Near the floor, partially concealed by shadows, he spotted a small square panel with an aged metal lock. There. Frank knelt down, heart racing. The brass key from the Bible fit perfectly into the lock. He turned it slowly, feeling resistance from years of disuse, then a satisfying click as the mechanism released. The panel swung inward, revealing a small compartment built into the barn wall. Inside was a metal safe, its surface dulled with age, but its construction solid and secure. A safe inside a hidden panel, Sarah whispered, awe in her voice. Grandpa really didn't want anyone to find this. Frank tried the brass key in the safe's lock, but it didn't fit. We need another key. Maybe it's inside the house, Sarah suggested. We didn't finish searching all the rooms. They carefully replaced the barrels to conceal the panel, keeping the compartment unlocked, but hidden from casual observation. Then they made their way back to the farmhouse, moving silently across the moonlit yard. Inside, the house felt different at night, more secretive, as if the darkness had awakened memories embedded in its walls. They searched methodically, room by room, checking drawers, cabinets, and hiding places that only someone who knew George well might think to investigate. In the master bedroom, Frank paused before his father's dresser, an antique piece that had belonged to his grandfather. The top drawer had always been off limits when Frank was growing up, designated as George's private domain. The drawer slid open smoothly, revealing meticulously organized contents. Cufflinks in a small wooden box. A pocket watch that had belonged to Frank's grandfather. A bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon correspondence between George and Frank's mother before her death 20 years earlier. Nothing that resembled a key or could lead them to one. Frank was about to close the drawer when Sarah pointed to something. Dad, look at the bottom. The drawer's base didn't quite match the sides. It was slightly newer, less worn by time. Frank carefully removed the contents, then pressed against the bottom panel. It gave slightly under pressure. He slid his fingers along the edges until he felt a small notch, then lifted. The false bottom came away, revealing a hidden compartment beneath. Inside lay a folded piece of paper and another key, this one larger and heavier than the first, with intricate patterns etched into its surface. Frank unfolded the paper, finding a handwritten note in his father's distinctive script. For Frank, when the time comes, the truth lies beneath what seems solid. Trust only Eleanor and protect Sarah above all else. What looks like rejection is really protection. The society's records are the last defense. Frank stared at the words, emotion tightening his throat. His father hadn't abandoned him. He had been trying to shield him from Reed and whatever dangerous game was being played over the water rights. He knew they'd come, Frank said softly, more to himself than to Sarah. He knew what they'd do to get what they wanted. Now we have the second key, Sarah pointed out, practical as always. We should go back to the barn. The metal safe in the hidden compartment yielded to the second key, its heavy doors swinging open to reveal stacks of documents, folders filled with papers, and a wooden box intricately carved with patterns similar to those on the key itself. Frank lifted out the documents, first spreading them on the barn floor and examining them by flashlight. Property deeds, water rights, agreements, maps of underground water sources, legal contracts establishing the Valley Protection Society, all dating back to the early 1900s. This is what Reed is after, Frank murmured, understanding dawning. Legal proof that his company can't take control of the water. Sarah opened one of the folders, revealing photographs of men standing before the barn decades earlier. Look, Dad, is that great-grandpa? Frank recognized his grandfather among the group, much younger, but with the same steady gaze that had been passed down through the Miller line. They were posed formally, 12 men holding a document between them like a prize. The founding members of the society, Frank guessed, the original families who settled the valley. The wooden box was the last item in the safe. Frank lifted it carefully, feeling significant weight for its size. The lid opened on smooth hinges, revealing more documents, but also something unexpected: bundles of cash, gold coins, and another sealed envelope with Frank's name written on it. Grandpa left you money after all, Sarah said, eyes wide at the sight. Frank opened the envelope with unsteady hands, finding another letter in his father's handwriting. Son, if you found this place, it means you've proven yourself willing to look beyond what's obvious. This is not just money, it is a legacy built from sweat, risk, and sacrifice. Some comes from the farm, some from choices I never spoke of. Choices I made to protect you and Sarah. You may hear things about me from Winston, from Stanton, perhaps even from other families. They will say I left you nothing, but you know better now. I left you the truth because you're the only one I could trust with it. The second key leads to what matters most. You'll find it where the water first reaches daylight. The old silo holds more than memories. Trust Eleanor. Watch over Sarah. And remember, a Miller protects what's ours, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who depends on the water flowing freely. Frank read the letter twice, then passed it to Sarah. As she read, he examined the contents of the box more carefully. The cash alone appeared to be over $50,000. The gold coins, perhaps another $20,000. Enough to pay off their apartment debt and give them breathing room until he found new work. But more valuable were the documents, proof of the water rights, the legal foundation that could stop Reed from monopolizing the valley's most precious resource. Dad, Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts. What did Grandpa mean about the old silo? Frank considered the letter's words again. The second key leads to what matters most. You'll find it where the water first reaches daylight. The old silo holds more than memories. I think there's a third key, he said slowly, and I think it's hidden somewhere in the silo. The grain silo stood at the edge of the property like an aging sentinel, its metal sides weathered by decades of sun and rain. It had been years since it held any grain. Modern storage methods had rendered it obsolete, but George had never torn it down. We should go now, Sarah urged, before those men come back. Frank hesitated. It's late and we've already found so much. Maybe we should take these documents to Eleanor, come back tomorrow for... A sound from outside the barn froze them both. Car tires on gravel. Headlights swept across the yard, illuminating the farmhouse briefly before going dark. Someone had arrived and was attempting to remain undetected. Reed, Frank whispered, gathering the documents and money quickly. We need to hide this and get out. He returned everything to the safe except one folder of legal documents, which he tucked inside his jacket. After locking the safe and securing the hidden panel, they moved silently toward the rear door of the barn. Frank peered outside, seeing two men approaching the farmhouse with flashlights. Not Reed this time, but Stanton and the security professional who had accompanied him earlier. "They're checking the house first," Frank whispered. "We'll circle around behind the equipment shed, then make for the trees." They slipped from the barn, staying low and using outbuildings for cover. The night was clear but moonless, providing just enough darkness to conceal their movement. They were halfway to the tree line when Sarah stumbled, sending a small cascade of gravel skittering across the ground. The sound was slight, but in the quiet night it carried. One of the flashlight beams swung toward them. "Someone's here," Stanton's voice carried through the darkness. By the shed, Frank grabbed Sarah's hand, abandoning stealth for speed. "Run." They sprinted for the trees, the sound of pursuit growing behind them. Frank knew these woods intimately, had played in them as a child, hunted in them, as a teenager walked them countless times with his father. In the darkness, that knowledge gave them an advantage. He led Sarah along a barely visible path, weaving between trees, crossing a small stream where the water would mask their footprints. Behind them, flashlight beams bounced wildly as their pursuers crashed through underbrush. "Where are we going?" Sarah gasped, keeping pace despite her shorter legs. "Eleanor's back pasture connects to these woods," Frank answered, guiding her around a fallen log. "If we can reach it, we'll be safe." The sounds of pursuit grew fainter as they pushed deeper into the woods. Frank's confidence grew with each step. They were putting distance between themselves and Stanton's men. Then a new sound froze his blood, the distinctive bay of tracking dogs. Reed's men had brought reinforcements. "They have dogs," Sarah whispered, fear finally entering her voice. Frank thought quickly. The stream they had crossed would buy them time, but not enough. They needed a better solution. "This way," he urged, veering off the path toward a rocky outcropping. "Your grandfather showed me something once." The rock formation rose like a small cliff from the forest floor. Frank ran his hands along its base until he found what he was searching for, a narrow opening barely visible in the darkness. A small cave formed by weather and time, just large enough for two people to squeeze into. "In here," he whispered, helping Sarah through the gap. "The rocks will mask our scent." They huddled together in the small space, listening as the dogs and men drew closer, then began casting about in confusion near the stream. After what seemed like hours, the search party moved on, their voices and the occasional bark growing distant. "That was close," Sarah whispered, her body relaxing against Frank's side. "Too close." Frank checked his watch, nearly midnight. "We'll wait a bit longer, then make our way to Eleanor's. We need to tell her what we found." "And about the third key," Sarah added. "In the silo." Frank nodded, thinking about the documents inside his jacket. Whatever his father had hidden in the silo must be even more important. The final piece that would protect not just the Miller farm, but the entire valley's water supply from Reed's plans. "Dad," Sarah's voice was quieter now, thoughtful. "I think Grandpa knew all this would happen. That's why he told me those stories. Why he showed me hiding places on the farm, taught me how to move quietly." Frank looked at his daughter with new understanding. George had been preparing not just him, but Sarah as well. The thought brought both comfort and concern. What kind of danger had his father anticipated that he would prepare a 12-year-old girl for it? "When we get to Eleanor's," Frank decided, "we'll call Margaret Cooper. She's a lawyer in town, not connected to Winston. We'll need legal help to understand these documents fully." As they waited for safety, Frank reflected on how quickly their world had changed. This morning he had been a man without inheritance, facing financial ruin and an uncertain future. Now he was the keeper of a generational secret, protector of valuable legal documents, and apparently the latest target of a powerful corporation, willing to use threats and intimidation to get what it wanted. And somewhere in the old grain silo waited another key, one that his father believed was the most important of all. When the forest had been silent for over 30 minutes, they carefully emerged from their hiding place. Frank oriented himself using the stars, then led them on a circuitous route toward the Jenkins property. They skirted fields and fences, staying within the tree line until they reached Eleanor's back pasture. The elderly woman was waiting for them on her back porch, a shotgun across her lap, and concern etched deep in her face. When she saw them emerge from the darkness, she lowered the weapon and stood. "Thank God," she whispered as they approached. "I heard dogs, saw flashlights moving through the trees." Reed's men, Frank confirmed, guiding Sarah up the porch steps. They came back to the farm while we were there. Did you find anything? Eleanor asked, ushering them inside. Frank patted his jacket. Everything. The society records proof of the water rights cash gold, and a letter from Dad mentioning a third key hidden in the silo. Eleanor's kitchen was warm and bright after the darkness of their escape. She made hot chocolate for Sarah and poured coffee for Frank and herself. As Sarah warmed her hands around the mug, Frank spread the documents on the table. The Valley Protection Society, Eleanor read from one of the yellowed papers, established 1923 to ensure equitable access to water resources for all residents of Clearwater Valley. My great-grandfather was a founding member, Frank said, pointing to a signature, along with your husband's family and 10 others. Thomas told me stories, Eleanor nodded, about how the early settlers discovered the aquifer while digging wells, how they realized its importance and created legal protections to prevent any single entity from controlling it. Frank examined a detailed map showing underground water channels flowing beneath the valley. The largest convergence point was directly under the Miller farm, with smaller tributaries extending outward to other properties. This is why Reed wants our land specifically, he realized. It's the central access point to the entire aquifer. Eleanor nodded grimly. George held the controlling interest in the water trust. Without his approval, or now yours, Reed can't tap into the main source no matter how many surrounding properties he buys. Frank thought of Reed's cold eyes, of the implicit threat against Sarah. They won't stop coming after us, will they? Not until they get what they want. Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact. Or until you stop them permanently with these documents. Sarah, who had been quietly following the conversation, spoke up. That's why we need the third key, to find whatever Grandpa hid in the silo. Frank nodded, fatigue settling into his bones as the adrenaline of their escape wore off. First thing tomorrow. For now, we all need rest. Eleanor showed them to spare bedrooms upstairs. As Frank tucked Sarah into bed, she grabbed his hand. Dad, are we going to be okay? Frank looked at his daughter, so young, yet so resilient, facing dangers no child should have to confront. He thought of the documents downstairs, of the money hidden in the barn, safe of his father's careful planning. Yes, he said, with more certainty than he'd felt in weeks. We're going to be okay. Your grandfather made sure of it. As Sarah drifted to sleep, Frank stood at the window looking out toward the distant outline of the Miller farm. Somewhere in that silhouette was the old silo holding one final secret, one last key to understanding his father's legacy and protecting the valley's future. George Miller hadn't abandoned his son. He had entrusted him with something far more valuable than simple inheritance. He had given him the truth and the means to defend it. Frank would not let him down. Dawn broke over Eleanor's farmhouse in ribbons of pale gold. Frank stood at the kitchen window nursing a cup of black coffee, his mind churning through everything they had discovered the night before. The documents spread across Eleanor's dining table told a story spanning a century of foresight, cooperation, and protection of a resource most people took for granted. They used to call water blue gold. Eleanor's voice came from behind him, startling Frank from his thoughts. Thomas said one day people would fight over it more than oil or minerals. Looks like that day has come. Frank turned from the window, noting the dark circles under Eleanor's eyes. She'd clearly slept as poorly as he had. Reed isn't just after money. This is about power, controlling who gets water and who doesn't. Exactly why your ancestors created the society. Eleanor poured herself coffee. They understood that some things shouldn't be owned by any single person or company. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Sarah's arrival. Despite the danger and disruption of the previous night, she looked refreshed, resilient in that way only children can manage. Her hair was neatly braided, her expression determined. When are we going to the silo? No good morning, no preamble, just focused on the mission ahead. Frank glanced at his watch. We need to be careful. Reed's men could still be watching the farm. Not at the moment. Eleanor pulled aside a curtain pointing toward her barn where an aging but serviceable truck sat. Thomas's brother is over there now. He drove by your father's place on his way here. No vehicles, no sign of anyone. That could change quickly. Frank knew they couldn't waste this window of opportunity. We should go now while we have daylight and before they return. Sarah was already pulling on her jacket. I'm ready. Frank gathered the most critical documents, tucking them into a waterproof folder Eleanor provided. The weight of responsibility settled over his shoulders, not just for Sarah's safety, but for the entire valley's future. If we're not back in 2 hours, call Margaret Cooper. Frank scribbled the attorney's number on a notepad. Tell her everything. Eleanor's hand closed over his, surprising him with its strength. You're George's son, through and through. He'd be proud to see you fighting for what matters. The drive to the Miller farm took a circuitous route, avoiding main roads where Reed's men might be watching. Frank kept checking the rearview mirror, hyper-aware of every vehicle they passed. Sarah sat silently beside him, her small hands clutching the folder of documents like a shield. They parked Thomas's brother's truck behind a stand of trees a quarter-mile from the property, approaching on foot, through fields Frank had played in as a child. The morning dew soaked their shoes, but neither complained as they moved with purpose toward the weathered silo that rose against the horizon. Up close, the structure revealed its age through rust stains and dents from decades of weather. A relic from another era of farming, it stood 60 feet tall, its cylindrical shape tapering slightly toward the top. The main door used when the silo was operational was secured with a heavy padlock that had gathered years of grime. Grandpa's letter said the water reaches daylight. Sarah circled the structure, examining its base. What does that mean? Frank ran his hands along the corrugated metal, recalling his father's words. The aquifer. There must be a place where it surfaces on the property. They circled the silo, completely finding nothing obvious. Frank's frustration mounted until Sarah suddenly dropped to her knees, examining something at the base of the structure. Dad, look, the ground is damp here. Sure enough, a small patch of earth near the silo's foundation glistened with moisture, even though it hadn't rained for days. Frank crouched beside his daughter, pushing aside tall grass to reveal a small seep groundwater emerging from beneath the earth in a steady trickle. Where water first reaches daylight, Frank murmured, remembering his father's clue. He began clearing debris, revealing a narrow drainage channel that had been deliberately constructed, guiding the water away from the silo's foundation. The channel disappeared beneath a flat stone that seemed ordinary at first glance, but when Frank applied pressure, it shifted slightly. Help me with this. Together they worked the stone free, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside lay a metal box no bigger than a paperback book. The metal had acquired a patina of age but remained intact, protected from the elements by its stone cover. Frank lifted it carefully, feeling significant weight for its size. Is this it? Sarah's eyes shone with anticipation. The third key. Before Frank could respond, the distant sound of a vehicle engine broke the morning stillness. They froze, exchanging alarmed glances. Inside, Frank tucked the metal box under his arm, guiding Sarah toward the silo's main door. The heavy padlock appeared formidable, but Frank knew his father always kept the key hidden nearby for emergencies. He felt along the doorframe, finding a small magnetic case attached to the metal. Inside was exactly what he expected: the padlock key. With practiced movements, he unlocked the door and ushered Sarah inside, securing it behind them. The silo's interior was a cathedral of shadow sunlight filtering through small ventilation openings near the top. Dust particles danced in the slanting beams, and the concrete floor echoed their footsteps. Though empty of grain for years, the space retained the faint, sweet smell of harvests past. They moved to the far side, away from the doors, and settled behind an old grain auger. Frank opened the metal box, revealing a third key, larger than the previous two, its brass surface engraved with intricate patterns, nestled alongside a folded sheet of paper. Sarah unfolded the paper while Frank examined the key. It was unlike any he'd seen before, clearly old, possibly handmade, with symbols etched into its surface that resembled flowing water. Dad, listen to this. Sarah's voice dropped to a reverent whisper as she read from their grandfather's letter. The final chamber lies beneath your feet, where our greatest treasure and heaviest burden rest together. The key opens more than a door. It opens the truth about our valley's heart. Use it wisely, protect it always. Frank looked at the concrete floor beneath them, understanding dawning. There's something under the silo. The sound of vehicle doors slamming outside spurred them to action. Frank scanned the circular space, looking for anything that might indicate an entrance to a subterranean chamber. Near the center, a section of the floor appeared slightly different, the concrete newer, its color not quite matching the surrounding area. He knelt, running his fingers along the seam where the newer concrete met the old. There, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, was a small keyhole set into the floor. Outside voices approached the silo. Frank recognized Stanton's tenor among them. "Check inside. Miller's truck is nearby. They must be here somewhere." Frank inserted the third key into the lock, turning it slowly. A mechanical click echoed in the vast space, followed by the sound of hidden gears engaging. The circular section of newer concrete, about 3 feet in diameter, shifted slightly, then began to rise. "It's pneumatic," Frank realized, watching as the concrete disc elevated to reveal a dark opening beneath. A set of metal rungs descended into the darkness. "Hurry!" Frank helped Sarah onto the ladder, then followed, pulling the concrete disc back into place above them. The mechanism re-engaged, sealing them inside just as the silo's main door creaked open. They descended in darkness, Frank counting the rungs 10, 15, 20, before his feet touched solid ground. The air grew noticeably cooler, with an earthy dampness that spoke of depth and age. "Dad?" Sarah's voice wavered slightly in the blackness. Frank fished his phone from his pocket, activating the flashlight function. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a small chamber hewn from bedrock. But what made them both gasp wasn't the chamber itself, it was what it contained. A natural spring bubbled up through the rock floor, forming a crystal-clear pool about 6 feet across. The water glowed with an almost otherworldly luminescence in the flashlight beam, casting rippling patterns across the stone walls. Around the pool's circumference, small niches had been carved into the rock, each holding documents in sealed glass tubes, metal boxes, and leather-bound journals. "The Society's vault," Frank breathed, understanding at last. The aquifer's primary access point. Above them, footsteps and voices moved across the silo floor. The concrete plug muffled the sounds, but the danger remained palpable. They were trapped underground with Reed's men directly overhead. Sarah approached the spring, cautiously looking into its depths. "It's beautiful. The water, it almost seems to glow on its own." Frank joined her, playing his flashlight across the pool. The illumination revealed that the spring was deeper than it first appeared, descending into a natural shaft that connected directly to the aquifer below. Small fish, pale, possibly blind from generations in darkness, darted through the crystalline water. A natural artesian well. Frank marveled at the engineering. The Society built a silo directly over it to protect and hide the access point. Sarah moved to examine the documents stored in the wall niches. "Look at all this. Records, maps, water quality tests." She carefully lifted a leather journal from one niche. "This one has Grandpa's name on it." Frank took the journal, recognizing his father's handwriting immediately. It was a detailed record spanning decades' water levels. Quality tests, legal maneuvers by various corporations attempting to gain control of the valley's water rights. George had documented everything meticulously, creating an unbroken chain of evidence. The final entry was dated just weeks before his death. "Reed made another offer today, triple what the land is worth on paper. When I declined, the threats began. Not direct, of course. Too smart for that. But the message was clear: sell now or face consequences. I've made arrangements with Winston. The official will shows nothing for Frank, a shield to protect him and Sarah, until they can discover the truth for themselves. If you're reading this, son, you've proven worthy of the trust I've placed in you. The Society's future is now in your hands." Frank closed the journal, emotion tightening his throat. His father's apparent rejection had been the ultimate act of protection, drawing Reed's attention away from Frank and Sarah while they found their way to the truth. Above them, the voices and footsteps continued, growing more agitated as the search proved fruitless. Frank heard Stanton's frustrated commands, the sound of equipment being moved, cabinets opened and closed. Sarah explored the chamber further, discovering a small alcove carved into the far wall. Inside sat a modern fireproof safe, far newer than anything else in the chamber. "Dad, there's a safe here, with a digital lock." Frank examined the keypad, considering possible combinations. What would his father have chosen? A birth date anniversary. "Try my birthday," Sarah suggested. "Grandpa always said it was the most important date in his life." Frank entered the 6 digits month, day, year. The lock remained unchanged. He tried George's own birth date, Frank's birth date, the date the farm was purchased by their family. Nothing worked. "Wait," Sarah's brow furrowed in concentration. "Remember when Grandpa would tell us about the Society's founding, how the 12 original families signed their agreement on July 4th, 1923. Frank completed the thought, entering the date into the keypad. The lock emitted a soft beep and the door swung open. Inside lay another journal, a USB drive, and a sealed envelope with "For Frank, open immediately," written across it in George's bold script. Frank tore it open, finding a letter and several bank documents inside. As he read, his eyes widened. "Your grandfather set up a trust," he explained to Sarah. "He transferred ownership of the farm to it 6 months before he died. The beneficiaries are us and the other remaining society families. It can never be sold to any corporation or developer." "So Reed can't buy it?" Sarah's voice lifted with hope. "Not legally, and there's more." Frank examined the bank documents. Dad established a separate account to fight any legal challenges, over $2 million. Sarah gasped. "Where did Grandpa get that kind of money?" Frank scanned the letter for explanation, finding it in the third paragraph. "You may wonder about the funds. Over the years, I received countless offers for mineral and water rights, all declined, of course. But I wasn't above using their eagerness against them. With Eleanor's help, I created several shell companies that appeared to control adjacent properties. The corporations paid handsomely for options on land they could never actually acquire. Every dollar went into the defense fund. Fighting fire with fire, you might say." Frank couldn't help but smile at his father's cunning. George had outmaneuvered Reed and his ilk long before they realized they were being played. The journal contained detailed instructions for maintaining the spring, monitoring water quality, and upholding the society's principles. The USB drive, according to George's letter, contained digital copies of all documents, video depositions from elderly society members, and evidence of corporate attempts to circumvent water protection laws. "This is everything we need," Frank realized. "Legal protection, financial resources, historical documentation." Dad thought of everything. A loud thump from above snapped them back to their immediate predicament. Reed's men were still searching, and from the sounds of equipment being dragged across the floor, they weren't giving up easily. Frank checked his phone, no signal this far underground. They were effectively cut off from the outside world, with no way to call for help or let Eleanor know they were safe. They would have to wait until Reed's men left, which could be hours. Sarah settled beside the spring, trailing her fingers through the crystal-clear water. "Dad, look at these markings." She pointed to carvings in the stone surrounding the pool symbols, similar to those on the third key. Frank examined them closely, recognizing they were not random decorations, but a form of map. The carvings depicted the underground waterways extending from this central spring, branching out beneath the entire valley like roots from a tree. Beside certain branches were names the original 12 families. "It's a record of the aquifer," Frank realized, showing how the water connects all the properties in the valley. The society wasn't just a legal entity, it was based on the physical reality of how the water flows. Sarah traced one of the branching lines with her finger. "So even if someone owns one piece of land, they can't control all the water." "Exactly. The aquifer is interconnected, impossible to divide or sell off in pieces." Frank understood now why his father and the other society members had guarded this knowledge so carefully. It wasn't just about legal rights. It was about maintaining the ecological integrity of the entire system. Hours passed as they explored the chamber, examining documents that told the story of the valley's settlement, the discovery of the aquifer, and the generations of stewardship that had protected it. Frank found records of previous attempts by corporations to gain control, some using legal means, others resorting to intimidation or fraud. Each time the society had prevailed through unity and foresight. The voices above eventually faded, but Frank insisted they wait longer to ensure Reed's men had truly gone. Sarah used the time to read through one of the older journals, occasionally sharing fascinating details about the valley's early days. "Listen to this," she whispered, despite there being no one left to overhear them. "March 1924. Today we sealed the pact in blood and water. Each family drank from the spring and swore to protect it for all generations to come. Some called it superstition, but I say it's something older and wiser, an acknowledgement that we belong to the land and water more than it belongs to us." Frank thought about those words, about the connection between his family and this hidden spring flowing beneath their feet. He'd always felt tied to the farm, but now he understood it went deeper, literally and figuratively, than he had realized. When they finally deemed it safe to emerge, the silo was silent and empty. Frank helped Sarah up the ladder, then carefully sealed the underground chamber behind them. The third key went into his pocket, alongside the other two, three generations of protection embodied in metal. They exited the silo, cautiously scanning for any sign of Reed's men. Finding none, they retrieved the documents and USB drive and made their way back through the fields toward where they had left the truck. They were halfway there when Frank spotted it, a black sedan parked beside their borrowed vehicle. Instinctively, he pulled Sarah down into the tall grass. "Reed," Sarah whispered, fear edging her voice for the first time. Frank squinted, trying to make out the driver through the windshield. "No, it's Winston." Charles Winston stood beside the sedan, his tailored suit looking out of place against the rural backdrop. He appeared to be alone, his posture tense as he scanned the horizon. "Stay here," Frank instructed Sarah, placing the documents in her hands. "If anything happens, run back to the silo and hide." He approached Winston openly, making no attempt to conceal his presence. The elderly lawyer spotted him immediately, his professional mask slipping to reveal what looked suspiciously like relief. "Frank," Winston's voice carried across the field. "Thank God you're all right." Frank maintained a cautious distance. "Why are you here, Winston?" The lawyer's shoulders sagged slightly. "To warn you, Reed knows you found something. Stanton called him an hour ago. They're bringing more men, professional types." "Why would you warn me? You're the one who executed the fake will." Frank's tone remained neutral, but accusation underlay each word. Winston's gaze dropped momentarily. "Your father asked me to create that will as a diversion, to make Reed believe there was nothing of value to pursue." He reached into his jacket, producing a folded document. "This is the real will. George made me promise to deliver it only if you discovered the truth about the water rights yourself." Frank accepted the document, warily unfolding it to reveal a straightforward bequest, the farm and all assets to Frank, with provisions for Sarah's education and future security. "Why should I believe you now?" Frank kept his eyes on Winston, watching for any sign of deception. "Because I've known your family for 40 years. A flash of emotion crossed the lawyer's weathered features. "Your grandfather was my first client when I opened my practice. I watched you grow up, watched Sarah take her first steps on that farm. What Reed plans to do with the valley's water, it isn't right." Frank considered the man before him, weighing his words against his actions. "Reed got to you somehow." Winston's jaw tightened. "My son's construction company was failing. Reed Enterprises offered an exclusive contract that would save it, and my son's house, his children's college funds, everything. All I had to do was help acquire certain properties." The admission seemed to age him further. "I told myself it was just business, until I realized what was really at stake." Frank glanced back toward where Sarah remained hidden in the grass. "And now I'm trying to make it right." Winston handed over a USB drive. "Records of all Reed's property acquisitions in the valley. Shell companies, straw buyers, the whole operation. My files, his files, everything I could access." "And why give this to me?" Frank accepted the drive cautiously. "Because Reed's crossing lines even I didn't anticipate." Winston's voice dropped. "He's bringing in security contractors, former military. They're not coming just to search Frank." The weight of the situation settled over Frank like a physical burden. "You're saying he's willing to hurt people over this?" "I'm saying he's willing to do whatever it takes to control that aquifer." Winston checked his watch anxiously. "You need to get Sarah somewhere safe. Then call this number." He passed Frank a business card. "Margaret Cooper. She's already expecting to hear from you." Frank recognized the name of the young attorney Eleanor had mentioned. "You contacted her. Your father did before he died. Set up a contingency plan none of us hoped would be necessary." Winston straightened his tie, a nervous gesture that humanized him. "I should go, if Reed's people see me here." As Winston turned to leave, Frank called after him. "The Society records the original agreements from 1923. Are they still legally binding?" A ghost of a smile crossed Winston's face. "Absolutely. The finest legal work I've ever seen, drafted to withstand exactly this type of challenge. If you have those documents, Reed doesn't stand a chance in court." Winston's sedan disappeared down the dirt road, leaving Frank standing in the field, the real will in one hand and the USB drive in the other. Sarah emerged from her hiding place, joining him with wide, questioning eyes. "Is he helping us now?" she asked, skepticism heavy in her voice. Frank tucked the documents away. "I think so, but we can't take chances. We need to get back to Eleanor's, then find somewhere safer for you to stay while I deal with this. Sarah's expression hardened with determination beyond her years. I'm not hiding while you face Reed alone. Grandpa trusted both of us with this. Frank recognized the stubborn set of her jaw, the same expression George would get when his mind was made up. We'll discuss it later. Right now we need to move. They reached the truck without further incident, driving back to Eleanor's house via an even more circuitous route. Frank kept checking the mirrors, hyper-aware that Reed's men could appear at any moment. Eleanor was waiting on the porch, tension visible in every line of her body until she spotted them coming up the drive. By the time they reached the house, she had already ushered them inside and locked the door behind them. Winston was at the farm, Frank explained, setting the documents on the kitchen table. Says Reed is bringing in professional security contractors. Things are escalating. Eleanor's weathered face registered no surprise. Thomas always said water would be worth killing for someday. She peered at the materials they'd brought from the underground chamber. You found George's vault then. Sarah carefully unpacked everything, arranging the documents with reverence. It's incredible, Eleanor. A spring right under the silo with all the society records protected around it. Frank inserted the USB drive into Eleanor's aging desktop computer. Files populated the screen, hundreds of them, organized with legal precision. Property records, corporate filings, bank transfers, email correspondence. Winston had delivered a comprehensive record of Reed's operations. This is enough to bring him down, Frank murmured, scanning through the evidence. Not just stop his water grab, but potentially put him in prison. Eleanor studied a geological survey from the chamber. That's why he's getting desperate. He's in too deep to back out now. Frank opened a folder labeled financing and felt his blood run cold. The documents inside detailed loans of over $50 million secured against future water rights Reed didn't yet control. He's borrowed against water he doesn't own, Frank realized. If he doesn't acquire our farm and the aquifer access, he faces financial ruin. A cornered animal is the most dangerous kind, Eleanor observed grimly. The sound of tires on gravel brought their conversation to an abrupt halt. Frank moved to the window, peering through the curtains. Relief washed over him at the sight of a modest sedan rather than Reed's vehicles. It's Margaret Cooper, he confirmed, recognizing the young attorney from previous encounters in town. Eleanor led her in, a slender woman in her mid-30s with practical clothes and an alert, intelligent expression. She carried a leather briefcase and the air of someone who didn't waste time on pleasantries. You must be Frank. She set her a briefcase on the table without waiting for an invitation. Charles filled me in on the basics, but I'll need to see everything you've found. For the next hour, they walked Margaret through the documents, the underground chamber, Winston's USB drive, and everything they'd learned about Reed's operations. The attorney took meticulous notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions or requesting specific documents. This is extraordinary, she finally concluded, reviewing the original society agreement from 1923. Your ancestors created an ironclad water trust that supersedes normal property law. Even with modern legal challenges, these protections would hold up in any court. So Reed can't take control of the aquifer, even if he bought every piece of land in the valley, Sarah asked. Not legally, no. Margaret adjusted her glasses. The trust establishes communal water rights independent of surface property ownership. Essentially, the water belongs to everyone or no one. It can't be privately controlled. Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Then we've won. We just need to present this evidence to the right authorities. Margaret's expression remained cautious. Legally, yes, you're in an unassailable position, but Reed has invested too much to simply walk away, and legal proceedings take time. Time we may not have, Eleanor added, voicing what they were all thinking. Exactly. Margaret tapped her pen against her notepad. We need to file for an emergency injunction immediately, but also secure both yourselves and these documents. I don't think Reed will stop at legal maneuvers at this point. Frank thought of Sarah, of the implicit threats Reed had made. What do you suggest? I have contacts at the State Attorney General's office, Environmental Crimes Division. With your permission, I'll take digital copies of everything to them today. Margaret began organizing the documents methodically. In the meantime, you and Sarah should relocate somewhere Reed wouldn't think to look. Eleanor frowned. My sister's place in Burlington is an option. Reed doesn't know about her. Frank considered their options, weighing safety against the need to remain engaged in the fight. We can't just disappear. The farm is still vulnerable, and these documents need protection. I can help with the documents, Margaret offered. My office has a secure safe. As for the farm, she hesitated. Reed can't legally do anything to the property without control of the deed which you now hold. But that might not stop him from trying to access the aquifer illegally. The implications hung in the air. If Reed was desperate enough, he might attempt to drill into the aquifer without permission, potentially damaging the delicate underground ecosystem that supplied water to the entire valley. We need to protect the spring, Sarah stated firmly. That's what the society has always done. What Grandpa would want us to do. Frank looked at his daughter, so young, yet so intuitive about what mattered. She was right, of course. They couldn't abandon their responsibility just because it had become dangerous. How quickly can you get the injunction filed? He asked Margaret. By tomorrow morning at the latest. I'll work through the night if necessary. Her commitment was evident in her steady gaze. But it could be days before a judge rules, even with an emergency petition. Days they might not have if Reed was truly desperate. Frank made a decision drawing on a lifetime of his father's lessons about standing one's ground. Here's what we'll do. Eleanor, I want you to take Sarah to your sister's place tonight. He raised a hand to forestall his daughter's inevitable protest. Just for 2 days until the injunction is filed. Margaret, secure the documents and get that legal machinery moving. I'll stay at the farm. Dad, no. Sarah's objection was immediate and fierce. That's exactly what Reed wants, to catch you alone. Which is why I won't be alone. Frank turned to Eleanor. Call the remaining society families, the ones who haven't sold to Reed. Tell them what's happening. It's time to reactivate the alliance George and Thomas maintained all these years. Eleanor nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. The old network. There are still 6 families who've held on to their properties. Good people, Frank, loyal to what the society stands for. If Reed wants to intimidate one farmer, he can probably succeed, Frank reasoned. But facing a united front of established local families with deep community connections, that changes the equation. Margaret considered the strategy. A public alliance would certainly complicate Reed's plans. It's harder to use strong-arm tactics when multiple witnesses are involved. And it buys us time for the legal process to work, Frank added. Eleanor was already reaching for her phone. I'll start with the Hendersons and the Washburns. They're closest to your property. The plan took shape over the next hour. Communication channels established, meeting points, identified watches organized. By dusk, the first members of the revitalized society had arrived at Eleanor's house. Weathered farmers, small business owners, and generational landholders with deep roots in the valley. Jim Washburn, a burly man in his 60s who ran the valley's largest independent dairy operation, clasped Frank's hand with surprising emotion. Your father was the backbone of this community. Always said this day might come. We're ready. Martha Henderson, whose family had farmed adjacent land since the 1930s, brought detailed maps of the valley's outlying roads and trails. Reed's people stick to the main roads. They don't know the back ways like we do. By nightfall, a rotation had been established. Society members would maintain a continuous presence at the Miller farm, watching for any attempt to access the silo or drill equipment being brought onto the property. Sarah remained adamantly opposed to being sent away, but Frank held firm. 2 days, he promised her. Just until we know the injunction is in place. Then you can come back. I should be there, she insisted, the mirror of her grandfather's determination. The spring chose to show itself to me, too. Frank knelt to meet her eyes. And that's exactly why you need to stay safe. This isn't just about protecting the farm or the water. It's about preserving the knowledge and commitment for another generation. If anything happened to you, he couldn't finish the thought. Sarah finally relented, but not without extracting a promise. Swear you'll call every 3 hours, and at the first sign of real trouble, you'll leave too. Frank agreed, though privately he knew he couldn't abandon the farm if Reed made his move. Some responsibilities transcended personal safety. As evening deepened toward night, the kitchen at Eleanor's house transformed into an impromptu command center. Society members compared notes on Reed's recent activities, shared information about unusual vehicles seen in the valley, and developed contingency plans for various scenarios. Frank absorbed it all with growing amazement. His father had maintained this network for decades, preparing for a threat he'd seen coming long before anyone else. These people had been the invisible support system behind the Miller farm's continued independence, a community united by something more powerful than profit. Margaret departed for the city with copies of all critical documents, promising to work through the night on the injunction. Eleanor prepared to take Sarah to Burlington, packing overnight bags and essential supplies. Before they left, Frank took his daughter aside for a private moment. He pressed the third key into her small hand, closing her fingers around it. The most important key, he told her softly. If anything happens, anything at all, you'll be the next keeper. The spring showed itself to you for a reason. Sarah's eyes widened with understanding of the responsibility being placed on her shoulders. She tucked the key into her pocket without argument, its weight a tangible symbol of her heritage. 2 days, she reminded him, then I'm coming back, no matter what. Frank hugged her tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair, drawing strength from her unshakable certainty. 2 days, he agreed. As Eleanor's car disappeared down the driveway with Sarah safely inside, Frank turned back to face the gathered society members. These were his people not by blood, but by commitment to a common cause that transcended individual interest. Reed thinks he's dealing with one stubborn farmer protecting worthless land, Frank addressed the group. Time to show him what he's really up against, a century of foresight and an entire community standing as one. The nods that answered him carried the weight of generations. The society his ancestors had formed in 1923 was alive again, awakened to face the threat they had always known might come. As darkness settled over the valley, trucks and cars moved out in formation, heading toward the Miller farm. Not as trespassers or invaders, but as rightful defenders of something that belonged to all of them, the lifeblood of the valley flowing unseen beneath their feet. The battle for control of the aquifer had begun in earnest. Reed's money and mercenaries against a rural community's determination to protect what mattered most. Frank felt his father's presence alongside him, guiding his steps toward the confrontation that would determine not just his family's future, but the valley's destiny for generations to come. Some inheritances, he now understood, were measured not in acres or dollars, but in responsibilities accepted and promises kept. And in that currency, Frank Miller was wealthy beyond measure. Dawn broke over the Miller farm with fingers of gold light stretching across dew-dampened fields. Frank stood on the porch of his childhood home, steam rising from a mug of coffee clutched in his weathered hands. The farmhouse behind him hummed with activity, society members coming and going, coordinating watches, sharing information gathered through the night. What had begun as an individual stand had transformed into something his father would have recognized immediately: community resilience activated in the face of external threat. Jim Washburn emerged from the house, his bulk filling the doorframe. Henderson spotted 2 black SUVs parked at the Valley View Motel, out-of-state plates, men loading equipment into the trunks at first light. Frank sipped his coffee, gaze fixed on the distant silo where the greatest secret and greatest vulnerability lay hidden. What kind of equipment? Cases, hardshell military type, and what looked like ground-penetrating radar. Jim's expression darkened. They're not here for negotiation, Frank. The hours since Sarah's departure had brought mounting evidence of Reed's preparations. Unfamiliar vehicles cruising boundary roads, strangers in town asking questions about the Miller property, a helicopter making low passes over valley farmland, at dusk illegal but deliberate, a show of force and resources. Any word from Margaret? Frank checked his watch, nearly 24 hours since the attorney had departed with their documentation. Called an hour ago while you were checking the silo. She's filed the emergency injunction. Judge Hampton is reviewing it this morning. Jim leaned against the porch railing. But law moves slower than men with guns. Frank nodded, understanding the subtext. Legal protection would come, but perhaps not soon enough. And Sarah Eleanor, safe in Burlington. Your daughter called 3 times already this morning, stubborn as her old man. Jim's attempt at lightening the mood fell flat against the gravity of their situation. Frank had slept little, his mind cycling through possibilities, vulnerabilities, points of defense. The silo remained their primary concern, the literal and figurative center of everything they sought to protect. A direct route to the aquifer that, if breached, could be contaminated or exploited before legal measures took effect. We need more eyes on the property boundaries. Frank set down his mug, decision made. Reed won't wait for court proceedings if he's as desperate as Winston claims. The morning unfolded with methodical preparation. Society members positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the property: the long driveway, the north field bordering Henderson land, the western edge where forest provided potential cover for trespassers. Frank coordinated from the farmhouse, establishing communication protocols using the farmer's existing radio network, positioning vehicles to block potential access roads. By noon, the farm had been transformed into a quietly vigilant outpost. Not a military operation, these were farmers and shopkeepers, not soldiers, but a community united by shared purpose and deep knowledge of the land they defended. Martha Henderson arrived with supplies and news from town. "Reed's at the courthouse," she reported, stacking groceries on the kitchen counter. "Showed up with 3 lawyers when word got out about Margaret's injunction filing." Frank absorbed this information with grim satisfaction. At least Reed was occupied with legal channels for the moment, buying them precious hours of preparation. "Margaret thinks Judge Hampton will rule by end of day." Martha continued sorting supplies. "She says our documentation is unassailable, the 1923 agreement especially." The kitchen had become their command center, the scarred oak table that had hosted Miller family meals for generations, now covered with maps, radio equipment, and lists of society members' contact information. Frank studied the property boundaries, mentally cataloging vulnerabilities, identifying places Reed might attempt to access the aquifer without approaching the silo directly. He could try drilling at the property edge, Frank mused, tracing the eastern boundary where the Miller land met a parcel Reed had recently acquired. "Angle under our property line to reach the water. We've got Pritchard and his sons watching that section," Jim pointed to the map. "And Sarah mentioned something about the underground water map from the chamber, the one carved in stone." Frank nodded, recalling the detailed rendering of the aquifer's branches. "The main water source, the artesian spring, is directly beneath our silo, but there are smaller tributaries extending outward. Less accessible lower flow, but still connected to the main supply. Which means Reed could potentially access the aquifer from adjacent properties he already controls." Martha's observation hung heavy in the air. Frank considered this possibility. The water quality would be compromised, more filtration needed, lower yield, but yes, technically possible. "Then why is he still so focused on your property?" Jim asked, the question troubling them all. "Why risk confrontation when he already owns surrounding parcels?" The answer crystallized in Frank's mind, pieces falling into place. "Because it's not just about accessing water. It's about controlling it. The spring under our silo isn't just an access point, it's the heart of the entire system. Control that and you can potentially manipulate water levels throughout the valley." This realization shifted their strategic thinking. Reed wasn't simply seeking water rights. He wanted the ability to regulate, redirect, potentially even restrict flow to other properties. A power play masked as resource development. Their planning session was interrupted by urgent radio chatter. One of the Pritchard boys on the eastern boundary reporting movement vehicles approaching through Reed-controlled property, keeping to tree lines for concealment. "How many?" Frank demanded into the radio. "3 that I can see. SUVs, black-tinted windows. Moving slow, lights off even though it's daylight." Frank exchanged glances with Jim and Martha. Reed was making his move sooner than expected, probing their defenses while simultaneously fighting the injunction in court, a 2-pronged strategy applying pressure from multiple directions. "Don't engage," Frank instructed over the radio. "Observe and report only. We need to know what they're planning." Within minutes, reports flowed in from other observation points. More vehicles approaching from the north. Men with equipment cases moving through the woods on the western boundary. A coordinated operation converging on the farm from multiple directions, clearly designed to overwhelm their defenses through sheer numerical advantage. Frank's phone rang, Margaret Cooper calling with critical information. "Judge Hampton issued the temporary injunction," her voice tight with urgency. "Reed is legally prohibited from accessing any part of your property or conducting drilling operations within half a mile of your boundaries." A legal victory undermined by the reality unfolding around them. "Reed's already moving in," Frank informed her. "Multiple teams approaching from different directions." Margaret's sharp intake of breath carried through the connection. "That's criminal trespass now with the injunction in place. I'm contacting the sheriff's department immediately." A pause then. "Frank, don't confront them directly. That's exactly what Reed wants, an altercation he can spin as aggression on your part. Frank understood the strategy. If Reed could provoke a confrontation, create a scenario where farmers appeared to be threatening corporate employees, the narrative would shift. Public sympathy, legal standing, community support all could erode rapidly. "We'll hold our positions," Frank assured her, "but sheriff's deputies are 20 minutes out at minimum. A lot can happen in 20 minutes. After ending the call, Frank gathered the society members present at the farmhouse. "Reed's people are moving in from all sides. They know we're watching, which means this isn't a stealth operation, it's intimidation. They want us to make the first aggressive move." Jim's expression hardened. "So we just let them walk onto your land after everything we've done to protect it?" "No." Frank's tone left no room for debate. "We make them cross clear boundaries. We document every trespass. We create a record of their illegal actions. But we don't give Reed what he wants, an excuse to paint us as dangerous, irrational obstructionists." They dispersed to predetermined positions, carrying cameras and recording devices rather than the tools and implements that would have been their instinctive choices. This wasn't a battle to be won through confrontation, but through documentation, witness, and unwavering presence. Frank positioned himself near the silo, the symbolic and literal center of everything they defended. From this vantage point, he could observe multiple approach vectors while maintaining proximity to their most critical vulnerability. The first incursion came at the southeastern corner, 3 men in tactical gear crossing the property line, with deliberate steps, scanning the terrain with practiced efficiency. Through binoculars, Frank observed their movements, disciplined, coordinated carrying equipment cases, and what appeared to be drilling components. Similar scenes unfolded at other boundary points, small teams breaching the property line, advancing with clear purpose toward predetermined objectives. Frank counted at least 15 individuals in total, divided into 5 operational units, a significant force for what should have been a routine land survey or preliminary site assessment. Frank's radio crackled with updates from society members witnessing these incursions, each documenting the trespasses from concealed positions. The strategy was working. Reed's people were committing multiple violations of the freshly issued injunction, each one meticulously recorded, until the dynamics suddenly shifted. "They've spotted me," Martha's voice came urgently through the radio. "2 men approaching my position." Her transmission cut off abruptly. Moments later, similar reports came from other observation points. Reed's security personnel actively searching for and confronting the society members monitoring their activities. Frank reassessed their situation with growing alarm. What had begun as a documentation operation was rapidly evolving into something more dangerous. Reed's people weren't simply conducting unauthorized surveys or assessments. They were systematically neutralizing witnesses to their activities. His phone vibrated with an incoming text from an unknown number. "Miller, last chance. $5 million for a clean walkaway. 1 hour to decide. After that, we take what we need." The message's implication was clear. Reed was escalating beyond legal maneuvers or intimidation tactics. Whatever he planned to do required eliminating oversight and creating a window of operational freedom. Frank's radio came to life again, Jim's voice tense but controlled. "They've got Martha, confiscated her camera. 2 more of our people cornered in the north field. These aren't just security guards, Frank. They're moving like military." The situation deteriorated rapidly over the next 20 minutes. Society members reported being confronted, equipment confiscated, some physically escorted off the property at the very boundaries they were defending. Reed's personnel established checkpoints on access roads, effectively isolating the farm from potential reinforcements or law enforcement response. Frank remained near the silo, watching through binoculars as a coordinated pattern emerged. Reed's teams were establishing a perimeter, working inward, in clearing operations, systematically securing the property section by section. Their movements suggested professional training and clear objectives. This wasn't a haphazard incursion, but a planned operation with specific targets. The silo, Frank realized with chilling certainty. They knew about the underground chamber. His suspicion was confirmed when the largest team, 5 men carrying specialized equipment, began moving directly toward the silo with unmistakable purpose. Their leader, a tall figure with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, directed their approach with hand signals rather than verbal communication. Frank's options narrowed. Martha and several others had been detained. Jim's last transmission indicated he was being pursued through the western woods. Law enforcement was reportedly blocked at road checkpoints established by Reed's people. The farm was effectively isolated, and Frank stood as the last line of defense before the silo and its precious secret. His phone rang Margaret Cooper again. Frank, Sheriff Davis is trying to get through Reed's roadblocks, 20 minutes at least. Where are you? At the silo, Frank replied, watching Reed's team advance methodically across the field. They're coming straight for it, Margaret. 5 men, specialized equipment. They know what's here. Get out now. Margaret's voice carried rarely displayed emotion. The injunction gives us legal victory, but it can't stop bullets. Frank weighed his options, calculating distances and timing. If they breach the underground chamber before law enforcement arrives, they could damage the spring, contaminate the aquifer. And if they find you protecting it alone, Margaret's question needed no elaboration. Frank made his decision when his father and grandfather would have understood instantly. Some responsibilities transcended personal safety. Tell Sheriff Davis to hurry. He ended the call and pocketed his phone, then retreated inside the silo. The massive circular space, empty of grain for decades, amplified every sound: his footsteps on concrete, his breathing, the distant voices of Reed's approaching team. Frank moved to the center, where the concealed entrance to the underground chamber lay hidden beneath the concrete plug. The third key was with Sarah safely away from the confrontation about to unfold. Without it, the chamber couldn't be easily accessed, but determined men with proper equipment could potentially breach it through brute force. He knelt beside the hidden entrance, considering his limited options. Direct confrontation would be futile and potentially fatal. Running would leave the chamber vulnerable. A middle approach, then delay, distract, create complications that would consume precious minutes until law enforcement could intervene. Frank worked quickly, using farm tools stored within the silo to create obstructions, equipment positioned to block direct paths, makeshift barriers from old lumber, and metal sheeting complications that would slow any attempt to search the structure thoroughly. He wasn't creating a fortress, merely a series of obstacles requiring time and attention to navigate. The silo door swung open with a protesting creak of aged hinges. Sunlight slashed across the dusty interior as 3 men entered. The tall leader Frank had observed through binoculars, flanked by 2 security personnel with holstered sidearms visible beneath tactical jackets. Mr. Miller? The leader's voice carried no hostility, merely professional detachment. Victor Reed would like to speak with you. Frank stood his ground beside a tractor part he'd positioned as a barrier. This is private property. You're violating a court injunction by being here. The man smiled without warmth. I'm simply delivering a message. Mr. Reed is prepared to improve his offer substantially. $10 million for the property, plus guaranteed water access rights for your lifetime. A generous resolution to this unfortunate situation. Not interested. Frank's response was immediate, requiring no consideration. The court has already ruled on the injunction. You're trespassing. The leader sighed, a performance of disappointment that never reached his eyes. Mr. Reed anticipated your response. He gestured to his companions. Secure the structure. Find the access point. The security personnel moved forward, hands shifting toward their weapons. Frank stepped back, maintaining distance while positioning himself between them and the hidden chamber entrance. There's nothing here, Frank insisted, knowing the claim was futile even as he made it. Just an old grain silo. Whatever Reed thinks is here, he's mistaken. The leader's expression suggested he knew otherwise. Our ground-penetrating radar indicates otherwise, Mr. Miller. There's a substantial void beneath this structure, approximately 20 feet down, circular in configuration. He studied Frank's face, reading the confirmation he found there. You see, deception is unnecessary. We already know what's here. One security officer began systematically inspecting the walls, while the other moved in a grid pattern across the floor, searching for irregularities. Frank watched their methodical approach with growing concern. They were professionals, thorough and observant. Discovery of the hidden entrance was inevitable. Even if there is something below, Frank attempted a different approach. The injunction prohibits any drilling or excavation. You'd be committing a criminal offense. We're merely conducting a non-invasive survey, the leader countered smoothly. No drilling, no excavation, simply documentation for potential future operations once legal matters are resolved in Mr. Reed's favor. A transparent fiction, but delivered with such practiced conviction that it would create plausible deniability in any subsequent legal proceedings. Reed had coached his people well. The security officer moving across the floor paused near the center foot, detecting the slight difference in the concrete section covering the chamber entrance. He knelt, examining the surface with trained attention. "Sir, found something." He ran his fingers along the nearly invisible seam where the concrete plug met the surrounding floor. "Appears to be a concealed access point. Circular section, approximately 3 feet in diameter." The leader approached, crouching to examine the discovery. "Excellent. Prepare the lifting equipment." Frank's heart sank as two more men entered the silo carrying specialized tools, a portable concrete saw, and what appeared to be a hydraulic lifting system. They were prepared to cut through the plug if necessary, bypassing the need for the key Sarah carried. "This is criminal destruction of private property." Frank protested the legal argument, feeling hollow against the reality of what was unfolding. "You can't just cut into my floor." The leader straightened, regarding Frank with clinical assessment. "Mr. Miller, you've rejected extremely generous offers. You've obstructed legitimate business operations. You've turned this into an unnecessary confrontation." He gestured towards the newly arrived equipment. "What happens next is entirely your responsibility." As the team prepared their equipment, Frank's phone vibrated in his pocket. He withdrew it carefully, noting a text message from Eleanor. "Sheriff, 5 minutes out with state police backup. Hold position." 5 minutes, an eternity given the efficiency of Reed's team, but at least reinforcements were finally approaching. Frank needed to create delay without escalating to direct confrontation. "Before you destroy my property," Frank addressed the leader, "you should know something about what's beneath this floor." The man paused, caution overriding dismissal. "Go on." "The chamber below contains an artesian spring, a direct connection to the aquifer." Frank chose his words carefully, threading between revelation and misdirection. "Break through incorrectly, and you risk contaminating the entire water supply." "Is that what Reed wants, to poison the resource he's trying to control?" Uncertainty flickered across the leader's features, the first crack in his professional demeanor. "Explain." "The chamber was engineered specifically to protect the spring, pressure differentials, filtration systems, century-old construction that maintains water purity." Frank elaborated on the technical aspects, inventing complications and safeguards, creating an impression of delicate systems that could be catastrophically disrupted by brute force entry. The security team exchanged glances, their confidence visibly wavering. The leader activated a communication device, stepping away to consult with someone, Reed himself presumably, about this unexpected complication. Frank observed their hesitation with carefully concealed relief. His improvised technical objections had introduced doubt into their operational certainty, consuming precious minutes as they reassessed their approach. Outside the silo, vehicle engines approached multiple heavy vehicles, moving at speed up the farm's main driveway. The security personnel tensed, hands moving toward weapons as the leader returned from his consultation. "Change of plans," he announced tersely. "We're withdrawing temporarily. Technical assessment required before proceeding." He fixed Frank with a cold stare. "This is a tactical pause, Mr. Miller, not a retreat. We'll be back with appropriate specialists." The team gathered their equipment with practiced efficiency, abandoning the operation with evident reluctance. As they exited the silo, Frank followed at a cautious distance, emerging into daylight, to find the source of the approaching engines, 3 sheriff's department vehicles and 2 state police cruisers coming to a stop in the farmyard, lights flashing. Reed's security team found themselves suddenly confronted by uniformed law enforcement, weapons drawn, orders being shouted for them to stop and identify themselves. The leader attempted to maintain composure, producing documentation and speaking with affected calm to the sheriff, but the dynamic had shifted unmistakably. Sheriff Davis, a career law enforcement officer with deep roots in the community, approached Frank while deputies secured Reed's personnel. "Got here as fast as we could. Roadblocks slowed us down. You okay?" Frank nodded, the tension of the past hour draining from his shoulders. They were about to cut into the silo floor. "Another few minutes." "Well, they're done now." Sheriff Davis surveyed the scene with professional assessment. "State boys are handling the roadblocks. Got reports of your neighbors being detained illegally. We'll sort all that out." He turned back to Frank. "Margaret Cooper filled me in on some of this. That true about the underground water source?" "All true," Frank confirmed. "Been here since before my grandfather's time. The society formed to protect it." Davis nodded thoughtfully. My granddad used to mention something about that. Never paid much attention. He watched as deputies confiscated equipment from Reed's team. Guess some old stories turn out to be worth listening to after all. The next hours unfolded in a blur of activity. Society members released from illegal detention. Reed's personnel identified equipment, cataloged statements taken. State environmental officials arrived, alerted by Margaret Cooper, to assess potential damages to protected water resources. Through it all, Frank maintained his position near the silo, its contents still secure, its secrets preserved against the assault that had come so close to succeeding. He'd kept his promise to his father, protected what mattered most when it mattered most. As evening approached, bringing cooler air and longer shadows across the farm, a familiar vehicle appeared on the driveway, Eleanor's station wagon returning from Burlington. 2 days of separation, apparently the maximum Sarah could tolerate despite Frank's instructions. She burst from the car before it fully stopped running to her father with unrestrained emotion. You did it? Eleanor got texts from Martha about everything. The sheriff Reed's men, all of it. Frank embraced her tightly, realizing how deeply he'd missed her presence, her unshakable certainty, her connection to everything they were fighting for. I thought we agreed on 2 days. Sarah pulled back, indignation mixing with relief on her face. You promised updates every 3 hours. You missed 2 calls. Been a little busy, Frank defended himself, but without real admonishment. In truth, he was grateful for her return, for the completion of their unit that had faced this challenge together from the beginning. Eleanor approached at a more measured pace, taking in the law enforcement presence, the activity around the property. Quite the welcoming committee you've arranged, Frank. Together they watched as Reed's security personnel were processed equipment, confiscated vehicles impounded. A methodical dismantling of the operation that had so nearly succeeded in breaching their most sacred trust. Margaret Cooper arrived shortly after bringing news from the courthouse. Judge Hampton has extended the injunction indefinitely. Reed's lawyers tried to argue extenuating circumstances, but our documentation was irrefutable. She gestured toward the scene of officers and detained personnel. And this certainly doesn't help their case. What happens now? Sarah asked, the practical question cutting through celebration to the reality still facing them. Margaret's expression turned serious. Reed faces criminal charges for violating the injunction, illegal detention, trespassing, a substantial list. His company's reputation is severely damaged. Shareholders are already demanding answers. But he still controls most of the surrounding properties, Frank noted. Still has resources influence. True, Margaret acknowledged. This isn't over, but the balance has shifted significantly. The society's water rights are legally recognized and protected. Reed's methods have been exposed. Most importantly, the aquifer remains secure. As darkness fell, a different gathering replaced the law enforcement presence. Society members returning to the farm, bringing food supplies, stories of the day's events from their various perspectives. The kitchen filled with voices, laughter, shared relief at crisis averted. Frank observed the impromptu celebration from the porch, taking a moment of solitude to process everything that had transpired. Sarah joined him, quiet understanding in her expression. Grandpa knew this would happen someday, she said softly. That's why he prepared so carefully. Frank nodded, recognizing the truth in her observation. He saw further ahead than any of us. Created safeguards, built alliances, preserved knowledge that would be needed when the moment came, and trusted you to be ready when it did. Sarah leaned against him, a gesture both giving and seeking comfort. Even when you didn't know what was coming. The night deepened around them, stars emerging in the clear sky above the farm that had been in their family for generations. Frank considered the layers of meaning in his inheritance, not just land and resources, but responsibility, community purpose. The truest wealth passed from father to son to daughter. I need to show you something, Frank decided suddenly, something only society keepers are meant to see. They walked together to the silo, now secured with new locks installed by Sheriff Davis's deputies. Frank produced the original key to the main door, then led Sarah to the center where the hidden entrance remained undiscovered by Reed's team. You have the third key, he asked. Sarah removed it from her pocket, handling it with appropriate reverence. Together they unsealed the chamber entrance, the concrete plug rising to reveal the metal rungs descending into darkness. Frank led the way, illuminating their path with a powerful flashlight. The chamber appeared exactly as they had left it, the natural spring bubbling at its center, surrounded by niches containing the society's records and history. But Frank directed Sarah beyond these familiar elements to a small alcove they hadn't fully explored during their first visit. Inside, barely visible until directly observed, was an ancient carving in the stone wall. 12 handprints pressed into what must once have been soft clay, now hardened to permanent record. The founding members, Frank explained, running his fingers reverently over the impressions left by men long dead, including our great-grandfather. They literally left their mark on the valley's future. Sarah examined the handprints with wonder. And they expected us to find these someday, to understand what they were protecting. More than that, Frank clarified, they expected us to continue their work, to be worthy of the trust they placed in future generations they would never meet. Sarah pressed her small hand against her ancestors' larger impression, connecting across decades with the most fundamental gesture of humanity, the mark of presence, of commitment, of continuity. We should add ours, she suggested, for whoever comes after us. Frank considered this, seeing the wisdom in her proposal, not vanity or presumption, but accountability, claiming their place in the unbroken chain of stewardship that had preserved this resource against threats internal and external. We will, he promised, once everything is settled with Reed, a proper ceremony with the whole society present. They spent an hour in the chamber, Frank explaining aspects of the spring's functioning that he'd come to understand through studying George's journals. The natural filtration system, the monitoring methods developed over generations, the subtle but critical maintenance required to preserve water quality and sustainable flow. When they emerged from the underground sanctuary, night had fully claimed the farm. The house glowed with warmth and light in the distance. Society members still gathered in celebration and planning. But Frank led Sarah in a different direction, toward the old well marked on George's map with the single word promise. There's something else we need to retrieve, Frank explained. Something I think George intended specifically for this moment. The well stood abandoned but intact, its stone circle rising 3 feet above ground level, weathered by decades of seasons. Frank produced a rope and lantern from a nearby shed, securing them, as Sarah watched with curious anticipation. The metal box you found before, Sarah recalled, with great-grandpa letters. Frank nodded, lowering the lantern into the well's depths. There was a marking on the box, a symbol I didn't recognize at the time, but I saw it again in the chamber on one of the oldest maps. The lantern descended 20 feet before illuminating the water below. Frank adjusted the rope, positioning the light to examine a specific section of the stone wall where water met rock. There, he pointed to a small metal object embedded between stones, another box just visible at the waterline. George must have placed it there recently. It doesn't appear in any of the old maintenance records. Using a second rope with a hook attached, Frank carefully retrieved the container, a modern waterproof case intentionally positioned to be discoverable only by someone who knew precisely where to look. They carried it back to the house where the gathering had transitioned from celebration to purposeful planning. Society members organized into committees, assigning responsibilities for monitoring Reed's activities, maintaining legal vigilance, documenting water quality and flow patterns across the valley. Frank placed the waterproof case on the kitchen table, the conversation falling silent as attention focused on this new discovery. He opened it carefully, revealing contents that brought immediate understanding to the assembled group. Inside lay comprehensive documentation of Reed's activities, spanning years, surveillance photos, recorded conversations, financial records showing bribes paid to local officials, environmental impact studies deliberately falsified to conceal potential damage from his operations. George was building a case, Martha Henderson realized, examining the meticulously organized evidence. Not just protecting the water, but gathering ammunition against whoever eventually came for it. This is beyond water rights violations. Margaret Cooper assessed the materials with professional precision. Wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, federal charges carrying serious prison time. Frank absorbed the significance of his father's final gift, not just the means to defend their water, but to definitively neutralize the threat Reed represented. George had anticipated the confrontation in all its dimensions, preparing not just for temporary victory, but permanent resolution. We need to get this to the proper authorities, Frank decided, already seeing the path forward. State Attorney General first, then federal prosecutors if necessary. The gathering dispersed near midnight, society members returning to their homes with renewed purpose and unity. Eleanor insisted on staying, taking up residence in the guest room with an authority that brooked no argument. Margaret departed with copies of George's evidence, her car loaded with documentation destined for official channels. Frank and Sarah remained on the porch long after the others had gone, watching the distant silo silhouetted against the night sky, the visible marker of invisible treasure flowing beneath their feet. "I was wrong before," Frank admitted quietly, "about what Grandpa left us. I thought it was just responsibility, the burden of protecting something valuable." Sarah looked up questioningly. "Isn't that what it is?" "Partially," Frank acknowledged, "but it's more than that. He left us purpose, meaning, a clear understanding of what matters and why it's worth fighting for." He gazed across the darkened fields, seeing them with new appreciation. Some people spend their entire lives searching for that kind of clarity. Sarah considered this perspective wisdom beyond her years evident in her thoughtful expression. "So we didn't just inherit land, we inherited a reason." Exactly. Frank felt profound gratitude toward his father, toward all the generations that had maintained this legacy while preparing for the moment when it would face its greatest challenge. And that's worth more than any amount Reed could have offered. The days that followed brought rapid developments. State environmental officials conducted comprehensive testing of the aquifer, confirming its exceptional purity and establishing protection protocols. Reed's security personnel faced multiple criminal charges, their testimony further implicating their employer in the conspiracy George had so carefully documented. Victor Reed himself was indicted by a grand jury on 27 federal counts ranging from environmental crimes to racketeering. His company's stock plummeted as shareholders abandoned what was increasingly viewed as a criminal enterprise rather than a legitimate business. Properties acquired throughout the valley were frozen pending investigation into the methods used to obtain them. The society experienced revitalization with descendants of the original 12 families reclaiming their heritage and responsibilities. Regular meetings resumed in the Miller farmhouse, planning sessions focused not just on defense against external threats, but proactive management of the water resource for community benefit. 2 weeks after Reed's failed operation, Frank and Sarah stood together in the underground chamber, now officially recognized as a protected historical and environmental site. They had gathered with society members for a ceremony formally inducting Sarah as the youngest keeper in the organization's century-long history. The simple ritual involved each member adding their handprint to the wall beside those of the founders, not in clay this time, but in natural pigment that would gradually become part of the stone itself. A symbolic commitment spanning generations, connecting past to present to future. As Sarah pressed her small hand against the wall, leaving her mark alongside her father's and grandfather's before him, she embodied the unbroken chain of stewardship that had preserved this precious resource against forces that would exploit it for short-term gain. Frank watched with pride beyond expression, understanding that his father's greatest gift hadn't been the farm or the water or even the means to defend them. It had been the opportunity to participate in something larger than individual life, a continuous act of protection extending backward and forward through time, connecting them to ancestors never met and descendants not yet born. In the spring's gentle bubbling, he heard his father's voice, not in words, but in the persistent certainty that some things must be preserved, not because they are profitable, but because they are essential to life itself. The most valuable inheritance wasn't measured in acres or dollars, but in the wisdom to recognize what truly matters and the courage to defend it at any cost. As the society members departed, returning to their farms and businesses throughout the valley, Frank and Sarah remained in the chamber a moment longer. They stood together beside the spring that had sustained life in this valley for countless generations before humans ever claimed ownership of the land above. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Sarah's question contained understanding beyond her years. "There will be others like Reed, different threats, same intention." Frank nodded, acknowledging the truth in her assessment. "That's why the society exists, why it will always be needed. Some battles can't be won once and forever. They need to be fought again by each generation using the wisdom passed down from those who came before." They ascended from the chamber together, securing it behind them with the same key that had protected it for a century. Above ground, the silo stood sentinel against the horizon, unremarkable to casual observation, but extraordinary in what it represented, the visible marker of invisible treasure flowing beneath their feet toward a future they would help ensure remained as pure as the water itself.